Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm Megan Matheson. I'm the co-lead of the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum and also the Director of Strategy and Engagement at Clear Seas. And my other co-lead, Ron Pillow, a professor with Dalhousie University, is also on today as well. And before I get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that today I'm joining from the traditional ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations and express my gratitude for their stewardship of these lands and waters since time immemorial. Just a brief word about the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum. It's a community of practice, and it is hosted by MEOPAR, the Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction, and Response Network, and Clear Seas Center for Responsible Marine Shipping. This community of practice is open to all who are interested in the work of understanding and mitigating shipping risk. And thank you so much for joining our first session in our webinar series focused on technology. So a little bit about the webinars. The purpose of this webinar series is to investigate different ways that technology is being applied to understand the marine environment, with a particular focus on the activity and impacts of vessels that are not using automatic identification system or AIS transponders. As a result of this knowledge sharing, community of practice members can apply the range of technologies in new ways to address information needs for a safer marine environment. This particular session focuses on the ways that satellite technology is being applied to understand the marine environment. Everybody, you're encouraged to raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and I can unmute you. Once we finish the presentations, we'll have some dedicated time for questions after each presenter. Or if you prefer, you can type your questions into the Q&A function. You should see a little box to be able to type Q&A. It might be under the more 3 dots button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll start off today with hearing from Colin Robertson about detecting dark vessels. As I said, we'll have some time for questions, a short break, and then we'll hear from Josh and Berkel about the smartWhale program overview and ecological modeling. Some more questions, and then we'll wrap it up for today. So I'd like to start by introducing Colin. He is the Director of Data Science at GSTS and an interdisciplinary scientist working in geodata science and ML/AI. He is also a longtime R user and fan. His research interests include geographic information science, change detection, discrete global grid systems, operational spatial models, applications to large-scale environmental and marine systems. He's currently Director of Data Science for GSTS, and previously spent 12 years as an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. And he has a PhD in geography from the University of Victoria. So welcome, Colin. Thank you for joining us today. And please go ahead and start your presentation.
Thanks very much, Megan. I will share my screen. And yeah, very happy to be here. I've attended some of these talks last year, and really impressed by the scope and the breadth of the work that's going on. So really, yeah, pleased to be here talking about dark vessels. There will be a little bit of about AIS, so maybe I'll apologize in advance for that. But I did also, yeah, as was mentioned, I spent, well, but to back up, I'm speaking from the traditional territory of this Nunavut people near Nanaimo, BC, is where I'm located, and I'm also thankful to live and call this beautiful land home. The kind of backstory for me is, spending 10 years or so in academia and working on publishing papers and getting kind of science out. And not being able to really get to the stage of operational tools and things in the hands of actual people, of operators and analysts in the real world. So for me, thinking about getting satellite data, machine learning models into tools that are, operating on live data that can actually affect decision making is really, really exciting. And that's the kind of perspective I'm bringing to this talk. So a little bit about GSTS. We are a Canadian maritime AI company developing data-driven solutions in the maritime domain, using kind of AI models, machine learning models, geospatial analytics with all sorts of data sets, many of which are satellite-based. The founding of the company, the CEO was the part of the lead or the lead of the team that developed the first satellites for detecting AIS signals from space. Oops. So we do a lot of AIS tracking and deliver our solutions and models through our proprietary SaaS platform called Oceana, which I will talk a little bit about today. Just as the context for kind of where our analysis and results are getting kind of delivered to. We see this as kind of a central platform. There's so many actors in the maritime space, so many different sorts of data sets that need to be integrated, so much value to be created by bringing data from different sources together. And so, that's where we see this platform, this maritime AI platform coming together to kind of integrate data and then provide solutions across to different actors that are regulating in the government space for ports. I've got another slide here that visualizes the kind of idea behind the applications, whether it's in optimizing just-in-time arrivals at ports, or in regulatory monitoring around emissions, or hitting decarbonization goals to protect it. So we've got a talk on smartWhales talking about North Atlantic right whale, but other marine mammals, being able to kind of bring all that data together into integrated models for better decision making. So what we're talking about here, though, is dark vessels. And so the basic definition of what is a dark vessel, there's this longstanding international convention around certain size classes of ships, large ships required to be having AIS on. So AIS being primarily for collision avoidance and ensuring safety at sea, but can also be used to kind of understand what's happening, what are the impacts of the maritime space, and all sorts of different things. And there's some recent, there's regionally specific implementations of the requirements. So in Canada, it's now 20 meters or more in length, or passenger vessels are required for what's called a Class A AIS transceiver. So a dark vessel is essentially, any vessel that is required to have AIS on, but doesn't have it on. And so it's dark to that sort of monitoring system. And so the implication here is that, the reason why people are turning AIS off when it should be on is that they're doing things that they don't want people to know about, such as illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, transporting illegal cargo, sanctioned violations. So these are things like illegal at-sea transports or transfers of oil. But there's also, so those are some real shots of actual, where authorities got out to detect these events in real time and were able to kind of, seize vessels. But a lot of the time, the AIS off, if you're just looking at a signal from a signal analysis perspective, is totally benign. Here's an example. This is in our Oceana platform, just in and around the Fraser River, and there's a pleasure craft that hadn't been reporting for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and it looks like it went into dock, and could it be getting repaired, or the owner's on vacation, or there's all sorts of reasons why that AIS is off. So we don't want to flag any vessel that has an AIS off. We really want to kind of filter out the ones that are significant of significant risk. And so thinking about the theme of this series being the role of technology in mitigating shipping, I think the risks of ignoring or inaction on dark vessels at the environmental risks are certainly around the risk for environmental disasters, so illegal at-sea transfers, the risks of overfishing or fishing in ecologically sensitive zones, security risks around contraband cargo, sanction violations. So we have vessels that are uninsured or they're outdated and haven't been inspected. There's lots of potential for things to go wrong at sea. But also operational risks. So, risks to port schedule disruptions if we have vessels kind of with AIS off that don't have their ETAs or the destinations set and are calling on ports, and that we have kind of some port schedule optimization tools. And so that we can kind of look at what happens to a schedule if we add in, 5% increase in port calls due to, dark vessels are showing up late when they weren't anticipated. So to get into kind of the nuts and bolts of how does GSTS detect dark vessels, there's kind of three overlying principles. One being there's no single method, two being there's no single data source, and three being we still want to allow flexibility. We want to provide the best intelligence through our analysis and models, but we also want to allow flexibility to do kind of bespoke, user-directed sort of analysis that can be totally explainable and can be configured on the front end of an application, for example. So I'll go through a few just at a very high level of our approaches. And so one AIS free, in a sense, approach is image-based vessel detection. And so we have data pipelines that are ingesting satellite imagery at regular intervals at a large variety of locations. On an ongoing basis, we have, so we've got models for radar data, for optical data at kind of moderate resolution, as well as at high resolution. There's, like any satellite analysis problem, there's pre-processing, there's atmospheric effects, there's corrections that need to be applied. We have object detection models, which then we pass those images through and detect, okay, here's a bounding box around a vessel. And then we can look through spatial and temporal correlation to see, what are the vessels in this area that are reporting AIS. Is the size of the detected vessel one that should have its AIS on in this location? And can we match it? And if we can't match it, here's a suspected dark vessel, is essentially the kind of data fusion part. And then finally kind of surface those results to a user interface where, analysts can see and work with that intelligence. So this is something that would be running kind of regularly on schedule. We've got images coming in automatically, the model detecting things automatically, outputting those results, and surfacing those results to analysts using the application. So here's just a little bit more of an in-depth example showing here's what the outputs would be in terms of the bounding boxes around detected vessels, and models develop around for large vessels right now. We've done some work with very high resolution radar data on smaller vessels and are kind of working on that right now, but deployed in production is large vessel detection. The AIS data at the same time in the same location to say, okay, what are the reporting vessels? And then let's do the kind of correlation to find out the identity and then flag the ones that, if there are any, that have no reported AIS signatures. So that's the kind of first bucket of methods. The second is what we call profile-based dark vessel detection. So this is an AIS-based approach. So in that, you can think of the image base as location, where we look somewhere, look for vessels, and then say, are they reporting? And in a profile base, we look at what AIS messages have we received, what's the gap since it's the most recent one before that, and is that gap unusual? And so here we have to recognize that AIS messages is going to vary. Those gaps will vary geographically, and sometimes by vessel, certainly by behavior. So we need to build up an expected frequency at a profile level to say this is an unusual or not unusual gap in terms of the time difference between two successive messages. And then at a regular schedule, calculate those gaps, compare to those profiles, and where they exceed, we call it a dark vessel anomaly, and flag that. And so this is kind of our way of creating our own expected frequency in terms of message delays, because if you have your AIS off, at some point you're going to turn it back on. That creates a gap in the system. So we're detecting these after they've already occurred. And then the third approach is the most simple. It's a simple user threshold in the interface where someone you can say, show me all vessels that haven't reported in 10 hours or 20 hours, etc. Identify those and then use that to kind of filter it down to more complex analyses. So some of the ongoing challenges are around validation. So it's for dark vessels that are dark in the sense of they have AS off and they're doing things that are they don't want you to know about. It's challenging to validate. We don't have masses of label data for dark vessel events. So we can validate our vessel detection models, but it's very hard to validate, activities around what's happening when vessels are dark. We have built a web scraping framework to kind of extract publicized maritime events and do kind of, cross correlations with events that we detect. But it's just an inherent challenge not having that kind of label data that you would in a traditional machine learning problem. Any model deployed live on satellite imagery at a more than a regional scale is going to require a lot of ongoing validation and retraining. This is certainly what you see in the image here is detected vessels that are actually chunks of ice that have broken off. This is in the Arctic in late August. And so we hadn't developed the model specifically for this region in this time frame, and so we were getting these pinging up as false positives. We noticed log booms in one version of the early models, and Salish Sea getting tagged as vessels. So, as we expand to new areas, it's just a constant kind of checking for false positives, retraining, and sometimes post filtering. AS spoofing is an issue that intersects with dark vessel activity as people are changing MMSIs, for example. So we're starting to integrate some of our identity analysis tools, like a tracking kind of IMO MMSI combinations into our dark vessel models. And then finally, for the high resolution data, kind of incorporating tasking, so we can do kind of intelligent tasking based on detections to say this is where we think we should look, but building that pipeline that integrates the tasking, the acquisition, the payment, all the kind of pieces required in the application is something we're still working on. So here's an example of some oil tanker detections. This is in near Vladivostok in Russia. The East Pacific, just showing detections at port. So this is some work we did around looking at the movement of oil for Russian oil tankers under the sanctions regime. And so given a single image, we can kind of pull out all the detections and then correlate those with AIS messages and look at who's not reporting anyways. And we can also use those ones where we get a good detection to then monitor later for kind of in other forms. So in this case, we took one of the detections and then monitored that in the application over time. So this is a oil tanker that was leaving from off the coast of Sri Lanka. And then in our profile-based dark vessel detection got flagged. So it started going over it's actually, this is very current. This is, it's currently kind of coming through the Bering Strait, I think. But taking that northern sea route, this is in September of this year. But, as it was rounding Norway, or I think, there's a 19.5-hour message gap. That's this inset here. So that's getting flagged as, okay, that's an unusual message gap based on the profile of this vessel. So that's something that would kind of ping. And then, but then the other thing that's interesting here is, so what you see where the red, that's a gap of at least 1 hour. And what you see as gray is gaps of less than 1 hour. So the whole time it's in that, through the Mediterranean, it's pinging at a regular interval. But in the northern sea route, it's frequently seeing message gaps of an hour. And that does, I think, do more to the coverage at the satellite, having no terrestrial receiver, terrestrial AIS up there, but having satellite coverage. and not having the history and the profile in that region for this vessel. But certainly the 20-hour gap there would get flagged and would be something that would, there's probably a purposeful dark event there that would be of interest. And just a quick overview of having these detections and these models in a single platform. This is a simulation study that looked at, for our port digital model, looking at what is the impact on average wait time if we took the dark vessels and increased the number of port calls. That would range from 10 to 17-hour aggregated wait time average, and we can kind of run through different simulations and different scenarios based on the outputs of those machine learning models. So it's just an example of the kind of, in addition to the kind of security and environmental risks, the operational risks that are kind of related here. So in summary, dark vessel detection is essential for reducing these risks. And, in light of kind of changing geopolitical tensions in the world and, the way that goods are moving around differently, there's a lot more dark vessel activity to monitor. We found that multiple tools and data sources are required, and they change as new satellites and new models come on board. And having this kind of maritime AI platform provides this kind of single pane view for kind of situational awareness and looking at maritime risks. And with AI and new data, there's new challenges. A lot of these models require lots of data, training under different scenarios, different environments, different sea states. So it's an ongoing kind of challenge to keep those models current and correct. As far as this bucket of capability around dark vessel fits into kind of the larger puzzle of what we're doing at GSTS, and all of these things are interrelated. Our expertise with remote sensing, oceanography, people that have been on ships for 20 years and understand what it's like to be at sea. So all of these kind of pieces can come together to kind of build these sorts of capabilities, which I personally find really exciting. So that's it for me. Happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Colin. That was really interesting to think about all the different ways that you can try and find out where vessels are if they are not actively reporting. So we'll just take a couple of minutes for questions here, and just kind of curious about thinking about all the vessels that are out there. What proportion of vessels are dark at any one time from what you've been looking at? Is it a small number, a large number?
It depends on how you define dark, I guess, as a classic academic answer, but it's small. Like, if we look at the really, long gaps doing what, unusual things, I couldn't put a number on it, but it's a small proportion, I would say. Yeah.
Great. We have a question in the Q&A from Anil Hain, and the question is, what happens after the gaps in AIS are detected, especially longer gaps like the 19.5 hours? I guess, what do you do with this information?
Yeah, like we have that in our risk analysis tool, and so we can surface those to the user. They're available in our API, so we can kind of bring the intelligence to the user, and then what the user does with that information is kind of up to them, I would say. So maybe they'll investigate further, get on the phone and kind of call and try and figure out what's happening. But we bring it to the level of these are the things that you should focus on, and then the user kind of, whether they're with Coast Guard or Navy or other authorities, would then take that information and run with it.
When you start looking for dark vessels, how long do you think, or how long does it typically take, or how much data do you need to be able to reasonably predict an anomaly? Like you're saying, you build up an expectation for vessel behavior based on how often they typically ping AIS. So how long do you need to be monitoring a vessel before you can tell if it's doing anything interesting.
Yeah, good question. We work at about a quarterly basis. So over the span of 4 months is kind of our general breakdown of identifying those profiles. And we'll see if they're consistent and if they're changing. If they're not changing, we leave them. If they're changing, moving to new areas, and we update them. And so some vessels kind of stay on the same path and hit the same regions, and some are kind of continually changing. So that's something we have to accommodate in the definition of those profiles.
Yeah, and I guess, some vessel types have much more regular routing than others. So does that go into your profiling as well?
Yeah, for sure.
Right. And we have another question on our Q&A. Can we detect vessels with AIS-B, which may not emit signals capable of being detected by satellite?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
if an AIS-B turns off, can you tell?
Yep. Yeah, AIS-Bs are not in our image base capability right now because our model, they tend to be smaller vessels. Our models are not currently developed on the moderate resolution to pick those up. But on the profile-based methods, yes.
Great. All right. Are there any other questions out there for Colin? And if you'd like to ask directly, feel free to raise your hand, or feel free to type it into the Q&A. Give people a moment to think. Who's most interested in the results of dark vessel scanning? Who's asking for this kind of information?
Primarily bodies that are responsible for enforcing regulations and authorities. So that could be border authorities or defense, Navy, that sort of client. But I think increasingly it might spill over into kind of operational as well. So ports and ones.
And thinking about the efficiency of port arrivals and supply chain, are you noticing a number of vessels that are kind of mucking things up by not having their AIS on to help with predicting berth availability?
Great question. Yeah, we've only done the simulation study for, I believe it was New York, New Jersey. But we're currently, so we have this like schedule optimization capability. And so we're building right now the ability to like look retrospectively and be like, what are the emissions, carbon emissions that observed, and what could have been achieved had, certain optimization techniques been implemented. So I think as part of that development, we can include some capabilities to look at impact of dark vessels in those scenarios.
Right, thank you. And then one last one from our Q&A before we wrap up. The question is, can you link detection of the vessels to requirements to have LRIT and the requirements to report position every 4 hours?
LRIT, what was that? I should
the person who asked this question, do you want to clarify? If you raise your hand, I can unmute you.
One of the things I can say that we are doing is, because the rules around reporting requirements are different in Europe and in Canada and regionally, like we're gonna, I think, build in some of those requirements into the filtering of the dark vessel detection capability. So like, if they're if certain vessel types and certain size classes are required in Canada but not in European ports, build in those sorts of logic just into the post-detection filtering to provide more context.
Great. And the clarification is LRIT stands for long range tracking, a SOLAS requirement. So can you link detection of the vessels to requirements to have long range tracking? and requirements to the reported position. So.
Yeah. Well, it's built in geographically into the profiles, but also into what we're doing now, building that into the filtering. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Colin. I really appreciate you sharing your work with us. And we're now going to take just a moment to switch over to hear from Josh. So if people want to take a minute to stretch or grab some water, we'll just get Josh set up and then we'll start again in 2 minutes. Thank you.
You see my screen?
I can. That's great. Thank you, Josh. Got a lot of logos on your front page there.
I'm presenting on behalf of a very large team, so
it's a big responsibility.
It is.
We'll just give one more minute and then we'll get going on this one. I know you've got lots to share.
I do. I probably have too many slides, but I'll do my best to get through.
We'll see how we go. If I have to cut you off, it's just what has to happen.
Yes, indeed.
But we've got time yet. Just a question from a attendee wondering if the presentations will be shared. And yes, we will be sharing the presentations and the recordings on the Clear Seas website. The Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum has a page where we have all of our past presentations and webinars, the slides and the recordings if you'd like to go back and check out any of the previous ones if you've missed them. And we will send out an email to all of the registrants once the recording and slides are up and ready for your viewing or sharing. Okay, I think that let's reconvene and we'll get started with Josh's presentation, finished Colin's. So I'd like to introduce Josh Van Berkel. He's the Head of Sustainability Solutions, Marine and Coastal for DHI Water and Environment, Inc. And Josh is a dedicated environmental expert. He has more than 23 years of experience, and his specialties include impact assessment and environmental management, including planning, permitting, and compliance. And he has a particular focus on the application of numerical modeling of environmental impacts from marine-based industrial and infrastructure projects. He's worked as an environmental consultant all over the world, including the Netherlands, Dubai, Singapore, Brunei, and also Vancouver. He's been with DHI since 2010. So Josh, I'll hand over to you to take us away with smartWhale.
Thanks very much. So today, I'll be speaking a little bit about the progress, let's say the components of and the progress associated with our involvement in the smartWhale project, which is a Canadian Space Agency initiative. And I'll be presenting on behalf of the entire project team, which consists of WSP, DHI, Canadian Whale Institute, Dalhousie University, and the University of Quebec. And what I'll be presenting on is the ecological modeling we'll be doing that we're undertaking to enhance North Atlantic right whale ship collision regulatory mechanisms. This project started approximately 2 years ago with the following objectives: to set up a hydrodynamic model, to establish key hydrodynamic cues in oceanic habitat zones. Secondly, to execute a North Atlantic right whale dynamic habitat model, to generate spatially and temporally explicit habitat suitability results. Thereafter, we undertook a agent-based modeling of the North Atlantic right whale that was integrated with both the hydrodynamic model and the dynamic habitat models. I should add that these models were initially undertaken in hindcast mode. After that, we aimed to develop North Atlantic right whale risk models as they relate to both fishing gear entanglement risk, but also vessel whale strike risk. And for that, we use an AIS-based modeling of vessel traffic. Thereafter, our aim was to convert everything from hindcast mode to forecast mode to enable a forecast of North Atlantic right whale vessel movement and fishing gear related risk. Finally, we're aiming to, and in the process of, converting this all into a decision support system to aid regulators in protecting the North Atlantic right whale. This project consists of a number of concerted and integrated tasks. Data collection was the first. We then moved on, as I mentioned, into the hindcast modeling, the hydrodynamics, dynamic habitat model, and agent-based models. It then involved environmental risk modeling, developing risk models for collision and entanglement risk, and then converting everything into forecast mode and moving towards the decision support system. At present, we are at various stages of task 4, 5, and 6. And we are in the final stages of the project, putting the various pieces of the puzzle together. So I won't go too much into the details of each model. It would take a lot longer, but I think it's important to show the model boundaries of the hydrodynamic model, because it becomes the de facto model boundaries of the subsequent models that are integrated with it. So we developed a 3D hydrodynamic model of the following area: Gulf of St. Lawrence, Scotian Shelf, and the Gulf of Maine. We used Mike 3, of the Mike powered by DHI suite of models. In the slide, we give a little bit of information about the flexible mesh resolution we use in various parts. Without going into too much detail, this approach allowed us to apply higher levels of resolution where we needed it, and to reduce mesh resolution where it was less relevant. Just some examples of boundary data that we used, or various input data that we used. We used various sources: GEPCO, NOAA, boundaries from HICOM, rivers from DFO and NOAA, and meteorological data from CFS, from NOAA CFS version 2 model. So again, I won't go into all the details, but a significant amount of time and effort was put into developing the hydrodynamic model to produce various output that we used in subsequent models for the project. The dynamic habitat model was one of those models where we actually derived various oceanic habitat information from the hydrodynamic model. For example, temperature, salinity, current speed. We looked at current gradients and so on and so forth. It was quite a long list. And we used that information amongst other empirical data sets that were both temporal and spatial. We applied what we call a dynamic habitat modeling process. In the past, this process was based upon a generalized additive mix modeling approach. However, for this particular project, due to various, let's say, data formats that were available to us, we decided to apply a machine learning approach. And after testing various different approaches, we settled upon an extreme gradient boosting approach. And again, I can't go into all the detail because it's quite involved, but the process generally involves data processing and alignment, where we develop what we call dynamic habitat predictor variables, and we use the underlying hydrodynamic model and other empirical data sets. And then we look at observation data of the North Atlantic right whale, and this data is combined into what we call a combined tidy data set. We then apply some machine learning approaches that iterate through what we call predictor variables, again derived from the hydrodynamic model and other data sets, where we ultimately look at which variables best represent where the North Atlantic right whales prefer to be. We apply various predictive accuracy metrics to it to find what we call the model of best fit. And once we found that model of best fit, we integrate that into the overall model platform that gives us what we call habitat suitability maps that are spatially and temporally dynamic. So this is an example of a dynamic habitat model for the North Atlantic right whale. On your left-hand side of the slide, what you can see is the predictor variables that we have found best explain where the North Atlantic right whale prefers to be, or what we call their habitat suitability. Of course, we do a significant amount of predictive accuracy and validation work. I won't explain that all, but I can mention that there's a lot of focus on making sure that there's no overfit, and that we get a reasonable, an acceptable level of validation. So once we have those models available, it allows us to use those models as a platform for another layer of modeling integration, and namely the agent-based modeling of the North Atlantic right whale itself. So we take the base models and various data, and we develop what we call ABM templates of the North Atlantic right whale. We set those templates up. We test those templates against empirical data, and through various testing and calibration rounds, we come up with a movement and behavioral model of individual North Atlantic right whales. So going a little bit deeper into that ABM model, like I said, we set up an ABM template and we initialized that template. In doing this, we had a lot of support from Dr. Maura Brown from the Canadian Whale Institute. And we did calibration and validation based on literature and observation data sets. Again, it's very difficult to go into all the details of this model, but what I can mention is that what we model is various modes of whale behavior: milling, foraging, feeding, resting, and diving. And what ABM allows us to do is it allows the whale agent to respond and make decisions based upon the environmental data that is presented to it in the underlying models. So in this slide, you can see that when we run these models and we test them against telemetry data, for example, and we're working to set up the model and initialize it so that we can match it with telemetry data. We also look at overall performance of the ABM model in terms of different time and behavioral modes against empirical data. So there's a number of different calibration and validation techniques that we apply to make sure that our ABM model best represents the movement and behavior of, in this case, the North Atlantic right whale. So what I can show you at present is a couple of preliminary hindcast results. We're quite advanced. We're nearing completion of the actual modeling process for ABM. We're one step away of having a final QA/QC. And what you can see on the left-hand side of your screen is North Atlantic right whale movements from April to May. And on the right, you can see those movements in July. In the animation itself, you can see the underlying dynamic habitat model, which is integrated with the ABM model, and the various dots moving around. Those are in principle North Atlantic right whale agents. I'll just give everybody a moment to look through them.
Just a quick clarifying question, Josh, while we're admiring these hindcasts. Are those actual whales detected through satellite imagery, or are they expected where whales would be based on the models?
The best way to explain this is the result of the ABM modeling output, and these whales are making decisions and acting on a partial stochastic level, where they're making individual decisions themselves. And really what this represents is our numerical modeling interpretation of how whales make decisions about their movement and behavior in this particular time period. And again, it is based upon calibration and validation against empirical data. And I have a yeah.
These are hypothetical whales.
These are whale agents. Yes, we are modeling
whale agents. Okay, I like it.
These are North Atlantic right whale agents. They have been set up in a way that mimics that includes known characteristics of North Atlantic right whale. So we are able to set up the agents in relation to a whole suite of information that we know about how North Atlantic right whales move and behave. So, as I mentioned, there's a lot of work that goes into calibration and validation. So what you can see here is in relation to 2017 hindcast, we are showing relative density of observations versus the actual ABM results, both spatially and temporally. So you can see the relative densities and the relative ABM densities. So on the left, you can see the sighting data, the observation data, whereas on the right, you can see the ABM output for the same period. And what we are showing here is within a plus minus 6 hour window. 65% of the time, our model had a North Atlantic right whale in the range of 1 kilometer from a known sighting. And 85% of the time, that was within a range of 5 kilometers. And 90% of the time within a range of 10 kilometers. So at this point in the project, we're quite pleased with how this model is performing. And again, it's important to stress that these base hindcast models become the foundation for the future, well, for the risk modeling, but also for the hindcast modeling and the decision support system. So I'll move on in the interest of time, because the next step is in a process that we're working on right now is undertaking risk modeling, and our theoretical framework is in principle that we identify spatial temporal encounters and assessment risk and assess this risk based on lethality, or risk and lethality based on established empirical methodologies. Just an example of some of the work from Van der Laan and Taggart. An encounter is defined as a North Atlantic right whale and Bethel gear occurring in the same time and within a certain area within the model domain. And collision lethality depends on vessel and whale geometry, speed, direction, swimming depths, and other characteristics. So again, let's move on, just to give you some of the hindcast results that we're generating. So what you can see is 2017 AIS data, the 2017 hindcast ABM data, and in the lower right-hand side, you can see where we are predicting in a hindcast mode the areas of higher collision risk. At present, we're going to focus on the regulatory zones from Transport Canada and DFO. But this is in hindcast, but like I said, we're quite happy with the results thus far. And I'll now talk a little bit more about our forecasting and decision support system. So at present, our modeling workflow for the decision support system will include organizing various data required to run the forecast. We will run a hydrodynamic model spin-up period. That hydrodynamic model will feed into, will feed into will generate a hydrodynamic forecast period, and that will feed into a dynamic habitat forecast period. And these two will allow a forecast of the ABM. And then we introduce a new player, so to speak, and that's the forecast of vessel movements. And Ron is in the meeting here, and we've been working with Ron and Dr. Jay Kumar on this, and I'll talk a little bit about that in subsequent slides. And then this forecast is run into a risk model, and it will be pushed out into a decision support system. So again, Ron is in the meeting, and I should give significant recognition to Ron and also Dr. Jay Kumar, who worked with various colleagues from DHI in coming up with a vessel forecast model that is in the process of being integrated into the overall model complex, namely Derek Eden and Tom Foster. And so Ron, if I'm saying anything wrong, please jump in. But working with the Institute for Big Data from Dalhousie University, DHI, we developed a machine learning based forecast model for vessels to allow us to forecast future risk. So in principle, we of course started with historical AIS data, and we now have a real-time data feed from Transport Canada by Spire, which provides nowcast data. Like I said, it's a machine learning based model used to forecast vessel locations trajectories and locations up to 12 hours in the future. The model couples with the forecasted location of the North Atlantic right whale to enable quantification of future collision risk in regulatory zones, thereby allowing for more refined decision making. It's a deep learning model. It's an AI sequential generative model, learns from existing patterns from data. It adopted a transformer architecture of deep learning to train the model. And the transformer architecture of deep learning model enables rapid data learning. There's a number of parameters, selection, and optimizations a part of the model. I won't go into it. But in principle, it takes 3 hours of data to allow for a model prediction of trajectory. So the short-term trajectory 1 hour forecasting is fast and reliable. The model was generally trained over increasing time spans, and the model was trained and is optimized to forecast a vessel position for the subsequent 12 hours. So here are some examples of the model output, where the input indicates 3 hours of AIS nowcast AIS data that's made available to us. The yellow indicates the actual AIS track, whereas the blue indicates the predicted track. And there's a number of other examples, and out of the interest of time, I'll go through them quite quickly. There's been a number of accuracy metrics evaluations undertaken for the vessel trajectory forecast. Root mean square, mean of trajectory coverage, and dynamic time wrapping. In principle, all the analysis show that the model is performing quite well. At present, this model we are taking the nowcast of the AIS, and it's been established we are continuously streaming raw AIS data. Forecast occurs on demand. AIS data is automatically QA/QC'd, and its missing attributes is replaced, and it prepares raw data for the machine learning model and generates forecast ensembles with the machine learning model. And like I mentioned before, this information is then passed on to the risk model. So in the end, we are going to take these various aspects, submodels, pieces of the puzzle, if you will, and generate a decision support system that will enhance regulatory mechanisms. We're in the process of that at the moment. In principle, this decision support system will allow us to illustrate various hydrodynamic model output, dynamic habitat model output, North Atlantic right whale output, both mostly in forecast mode. Some of it we will show some hindcast results, and again, it will also provide forecast risk output in various reports. So I think that is my last slide, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Josh. That's a lot of information, but really exciting to see how you're taking all these different layers and putting them together to try and understand the potential interactions between the North Atlantic right whales and vessels. I've got a few questions, so I'll start with that, and we'll see if our attendees have anything as well. So again, please feel free to put questions into the Q&A or raise your hand, and I'll unmute you so you can ask your question directly, whichever you prefer. So I know you're just giving us quite a quick overview of quite a lot of work that's been going on. Would you be able to talk a little bit more about what you discovered in terms of habitat suitability? Like, what variables were most helpful in understanding how the whales were moving about, or the hypothetical whale could be moving about?
Yes, and I think, as I mentioned, it's an iterative process looking at various predictor variables, and then finding those that are basically the best fit. In this particular case, what we found were the predictive variables of best fit were temperature, water temperature at the bottom, net primary production surface. This data was derived from Copernicus, in fact. Surface temperature, and again, when we're looking at these variables, the bars are indicating level of importance in terms of explaining where the North Atlantic right whale prefer to be. Surface salinity, something called Brunt-Vänsala metric, and that indicates a level of stratification, and current speed at the surface. I should mention that one of our predictor variables was output from a Calanus model. That's the key prey for the North Atlantic right whale.
Mm-hmm.
That model was prepared using a random forest modeling approach from WSP. However, that model did not prove to be one of the a better predictor variable than, for example, net primary production. So those are the most important predictors.
And it seems like there's not a lot of, like, they all seem quite important in terms of the length of the bars there.
Yeah, you can say that. Again, I think we probably tested probably 20 different iterations, if not more, of looking at various combinations of predictor variables. So, but yeah, there is in this particular case, their level of importance is similar.
Great. So to continue on the topic of the whale model, Alexandra Mayette's asking, for the right whale model, do you use data from specific years to build the movement of the agent whales and have different movement for different years? Or are you using the same distribution to compare with different years of AIS data?
So we did 5 years of modeling. And so we hindcasted 5 years, and I should say this right, 2019 to 2015. So we used those years of hydrodynamics, and we took the same years for North Atlantic right whale observations, and we used all those 5 years to do the modeling. If that answers the question.
And then did you also take a look at vessels for those same years, or did you take that model and then you're looking at going forward future vessel predictions?
Yeah, we also used, I actually think we had more years of AIS data, but we overlapped the years of data. Yeah.
Thank you. Just talking about AIS data, Anil Hain has a question about what types of AIS feeds are you using in your detection modeling? Terrestrial, space-based, fused feed?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd have to go back and look at the original data set. We received a data set from Transport Canada, and it was a collection of various different AIS data. And there was a number of data processing steps. I'd have to look back and give you a little bit more input on that. My apologies.
Right. So it was a Transport Canada data set, though.
Indeed, it was arranged through a data request, arranged through by WSP.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is from Samuel Mansfield. Thank you for your presentation. Informed by the methods and lessons learned used for the North Atlantic right whale, I'm curious what your thoughts are on opportunities and likely challenges of replicating these efforts in other areas, such as the Pacific coast.
I think there are a lot of opportunities. I should add that this level of modeling is something that we've done in other parts of the world. So we're quite confident that the overall framework or approach framework would work in other parts of the world. It's really key to have a suite of models that allow you to integrate them readily. And so it's one of the things that we focused on as a company to allow our models to integrate. So that's certainly a challenge for others who would attempt something like this. You have to have a high level of integration. But I would say that I believe that integrated ecological modeling is certainly it's certainly a way of the future. Not only can you establish these models, but you can establish them as management support tools. So yeah, I'm quite excited about the future of using this type of modeling approach. I should say I don't think it's a solve-all. I think it's another layer of tools that support positive decision making. Yeah, and I'm excited. I think what's necessary is there needs to be focused and data sets available to make these models. That is certainly a challenge. If you don't have the right data, it's very difficult to make these models. Yeah, so that would certainly be one of the challenges, making sure that the data sets are available to both set them up and to calibrate them and eventually to validate them.
Absolutely. It's your model is nothing without the data to build it from.
Exactly. Yeah.
We've got another question from Alexandra Mayette. When assessing risk of vessel strike, are you looking at a daily scale, a monthly, or annual?
So, so when we forecast, we are able to forecast. The hydrodynamic forecast is 3 days in advance, and so that allows us, and that's based on let's say underlying data that allows us to do a hydrodynamic forecast. And because that hydrodynamic forecast is key to the other models, in principle, the dynamic habitat model and the ABM model is also limited to a 3-day forecast. But what we found is that both practically speaking and also technically speaking, we were able to do the vessel forecast accurately at about 12 hours. So we are able to give a 3-day forecast of dynamic habitat modeling output or habitat suitability, 3-day forecast of hydrodynamic output, and a 3-day forecast of ABM output, and then a 12-hour forecast of risk output.
And that would be where the vessels are likely to be?
The risk output is where you would find an increased level of vessel encounters between the whales, with the whales, and or a vessel and or fishing gear entanglement risk. I should add one of the things we're doing is we're taking an ensemble approach to some of the risk modeling as well, where we model several scenarios to allow us to give probabilities rather than just tracks.
Mm-hmm. Just to kind of follow up on that, so when you're looking at the vessel trajectory, you showed us the tracks of how you kind of checked the accuracy of the prediction of where the vessel was expected to travel and where it actually did. How far in advance, like how many hours or days can you reasonably predict the vessel's patterns?
That's 12 hours.
12 hours, okay. Same
and
as your risk.
It actually coincides with a typical. It generally coincides with a typical, let's say, the typical time it would take a vessel, cargo vessel, a tanker to basically get through the regulatory zone.
Right.
Yeah.
And so thinking about that regulatory zone, how do you anticipate that, say, Transport Canada might be able to use the model outputs to optimize the vessel slowdown zones that have been established in the Gulf of St. Lawrence?
So when we originally developed the approach, our thought would be that it would allow Transport Canada or DFO to take the data and apply, for example, vessel slowdown periods with a little bit more refinement. To really use the forecast to allow them to refine slowdown periods when it's most needed, you know, in a sense, taking something that's a little bit more of a blanket approach and refining it when it's when it's clear that it's most needed, and that way, basically getting a little bit of a sharper regulatory approach.
And I think that would be also appreciated by the shipping industry to have,
exactly
know that your slowdown is actually necessary and in response to actual conditions or likely conditions.
Yes, we see this as a sustainability tool on both sides, for both for the North Atlantic right whale, but also to allow shipping to also occur as sustainably as possible.
Right. Are there any other questions for Josh, and or any other questions for Colin before we wrap up for today? Anybody has thought of anything as you've been reflecting? How much longer is this project underway for? I know you're in the later stages right now.
We are scheduled to give our final presentation in January of next year. And so at present, we're basically assembling all the various model components into the decision support system with colleagues from WSP.
Great. So we'll have to look forward to seeing the results. And then following that, do you anticipate it being put into action in preparation for the spring slowdown zone?
That's up to government agencies that we're talking to. This is a Canadian Space Agency initiative, but we're certainly presenting some of our preliminary results to Transport Canada and DFO, and ultimately it will be their decision on how this tool will be used in the future.
Fingers crossed it can make for a more dynamic and safer Gulf of the St. Lawrence.
We hope so.
All right, last call for any questions. Thank you all for the great questions that have been asked so far, and really appreciate everybody taking the time to join us today to learn more about some of the interesting work using satellite technology to result in a safer and more sustainable shipping environment. As I mentioned before, we will have the recording and slides available. We'll post those online, and I will send out an email to all registrants letting you know when those are available. And I also wanted to make sure you're aware that we will be continuing this conversation, this discussion in 2 weeks on October 5th, and still at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And we'll be featuring applications of aerial technology such as planes and drones. And I hope that we'll see you all there. It's going to be another interesting presentation. We've got a number of speakers who will be presenting the work that they're doing, and we'll have a little bit more of a focus on the West Coast for the next session. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Colin. And take care, everyone. Have a great day.